Welcome to CGI Voices, where CGI's experts share insights on the latest in federal government management, policy, and technology. I'm your host, Pete Tseronis. Welcome back to CGI Voices, where I have the pleasure of having a conversation with Miss Ratima Kataria, director and a CGI expert here at this wonderful organization. We're going to talk a little bit about data. We're going to talk a little about her passion for data. We're going to also talk about how the government is leaning heavily on data as a strategic asset. And we might even spin in the focus on federal health IT and the importance of data in that sector. So, Ratima, it's great to see you.
Very good to see you as well, Pete. Very excited to be here with you this afternoon.
Can you talk a little bit about your personal and professional journey and that passion that just clearly over time has just gotten stronger and stronger for the partnerships needed in government and industry, and why you love being in this organization and what brought you here?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I'll start off with saying that, so I'm an engineer by education and training, an electronics and electrical engineer. Started my career about 26 plus years ago in the semiconductor industry. And that was a turning point in the semiconductor industry. Talk about emerging technology. We were trying to pack over 1 million logic gates into an integrated circuit, 1 square inch in size, and program it using code. So that was unheard of back at the time. I had the pleasure and honor of helping several global clients convert their big products into much smaller footprint across a variety of industries in telecom, in medical devices, manufacturing, and so on. Another interesting thing I like to always say about back that time in the late 90s is I was one of the very few women in that industry. So that was an interesting experience in itself. Subsequent to that, I spent about a decade in satellite communications. And once again, there it was more about penetrating into the emerging markets in maritime, avionics, trying to get internet connectivity on airplanes and ships for over the air. I also designed and implemented some security protocols for transmission security, TransX, which were over the air. So I spent about a decade doing that, but all along it was again penetrating into the emerging markets and doing some digital transformation and disruptive transformation. And after that, somehow I managed to find my way into federal healthcare and have been doing that for almost a decade now. I've been both on the government consulting services side of things as well as in the federal government, very similar to you as well, Pete, there. And I would like to say that I actually was serving as a deputy CIO prior to joining CGI at Department of Health and Human Services, one of their operating divisions, HRSA. And HRSA played a very critical role in responding to the nationwide response to the pandemic when it took place. So I personally feel very, very grateful for the opportunity and having that honor to serve in the federal government during COVID and be part of that nationwide response. Subsequent to that, so my passion in healthcare just continued, but it was my calling to come back to the industry. I still am very embedded in the federal healthcare and especially the HHS ecosystem. I love to help move the needle there. And I wanted to find home in a place where we lead with mission, where there is collaborative culture, and where we try to understand the customer problems and then come up with the right solutions. So CGI felt like the perfect home for doing that. And here I am. I am a growth enabler, and throughout my career, emerging markets has been one of the things that I've enjoyed doing. And that's what I do here at CGI.
Well, that's a story and a journey in and of itself, and I'm sure there's just an anecdotal or use case or something along each one of those stops along that journey where you were able to tap into that curiosity and that interest. And it's interesting you bring up when you were working in telecommunications, and data at the time was not something that we can download to our phone or have at our fingertips like we do today. So I had a quick follow-on question to, it's almost like when the internet was first forming, there was the infrastructure component.
That's right.
How significant was the governance of data back then, or was it just you had volumes of it and you tried to make as much sense of it back in the day? And now, as we get into discussions around healthcare and data with so much, technology's played a significant role. That's the people, process, technology, enterprise architecture paradigm we talked about. So what has been the biggest change you've seen in getting your handle of data when it comes to health data?
There are a couple of things that are different and a paradigm shift from what used to be there to now. A few things I would say is that back when there were more of infrastructural innovations going on, at the end of the day, it was still data that went back and forth. So all things today you hear about zero trust, security, data governance. These things did not necessarily have a formal term back then, but that didn't mean that the essence of it did not exist. So the essence of it existed still. It just was at a smaller scale, and some of the formal mechanisms were not around it. And the other thing that is different, certainly, that most people would agree now is that just the whole sheer volume and velocity and the complexity of data has increased tremendously over the last, couple of decades or so. And the current volume and velocity and the complexity of data we see definitely has not been heard of before. So that's different.
Yeah,
sure.
no, that you hit on the volume, velocity, variety, veracity of data, the power of the cloud, and thank you, because I remember back in the day when I worked in a data center that there would be firewall logs, and I would say to my colleague, he'd say, I'll get back to you in a week once I go through it to find the needle in the haystack.
Right.
I'd say, that was good enough. That's not good enough now.
That's
it has
not
to be
good
done
enough.
quickly. So awesome. So that tees us up to move in to a discussion around the data as a strategic asset, which I will add is one of the 4 pillars heading into fiscal year 24. What are your guiding principles of how to get the conversation going with a potential customer as to how to think about data?
Sure. So I'm going to start again with saying is actually let's go as way back as 2018 when Evidence Act was first put in place. That's when the federal government started putting a little bit more emphasis and formality around trying to leverage data as a strategic asset. So a couple of different things happened after the Evidence Act was put in place. From, again, getting some mechanisms in place to make this a reality is, one, you see that chief data officers were identified in a lot of federal agencies. A few years ago, chief data officers were not a thing. People worked with data, but that there was no formality around it, right? Second, actually, if you look at it, there is a federal CDO council, which is where all the CDOs from across various federal agencies, they come together, they talk about lessons learned, industry best practices, how to overcome the challenges, and so on. So there is a lot more cohesive momentum around these efforts in the last few years. What I want to say is, so that is starting at the top, going a few years ago.
And that's governance. That's putting in governance, if I'm hearing you right. Get a title,
Yes.
a new chief something, but you have governance, and that's important. So,
Yes, absolutely. Governance is a big piece of it. Even before governance, what I want to share is there is a lot more pronounced appreciation of the fact that data is a strategic asset. Yes, we have been using this phrase. Sometimes it can even become like a cliched phrase. We have been using this phrase for a long time. But truly, for the agencies to make sure that it shows up in their strategic plans, it ties to their mission outcomes, those things are extremely important. And we are starting to see that more and more. Now, since COVID, what is one of the things that we learned in COVID is, I think we all would agree that to some extent, we were, as a global ecosystem, caught a little flat-footed with the global pandemic, right? Is some of it has also brought to light how fragmented we are as a global public health ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it goes back to the lack of ability to share and exchange data accurately, timely, securely, contextually. And again, these are phrases we hear all the time, but I feel that in the last few years, since the COVID pandemic, especially in the healthcare space, there is a lot more emphasis and focus on trying to move the needle in the right direction. And the right funding behind it as well.
So can I just pivot the governance you hit on, obviously putting people in place with roles and responsibilities to convene the conversation. And then there's the pandemic. And to use some of you, again, your perfect words for, there's so much data flying around. There's a world we live in where we don't trust, or we are taught to have zero trust. It's making sure that data has integrity and fidelity, but then the systems have to work and communicate. And I think we saw that you can put a lot of people in a room to solve a problem, but you do rely on technology. So can we take it down from governance to we have a disparate world that is trying to make sense of a health concern, And then how do you start getting those systems to start talking to one another?
You ask a very good question there, Pete. And what I would say is this is a classic thing that most agencies start looking at is how do we get the systems to talk to each other? And I think that's where some of our consultative mindset comes into play, which is very big at CGI, and that's how we like to lead our customers as well. Is you got to take a step back and think about first, what is your data strategy for your organization? It is never going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. There are a lot of things you hear about cookie cutter data strategy, but like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Is taking a step back and thinking about one, a holistic, and second, a cohesive data strategy that's going to work for your organization, because there are unique nuances with every single mission, with every single organization, and their process, people, and technology. So when you think about the data strategy, that's where you have to start from the top. Is the first and the most important thing that we got to baseline ourselves in is how do you tie it to the mission strategy? Right? What is that agency trying to accomplish at the end of the day for the citizens, for the public, from a public health standpoint, and making sure the data strategy is going to lend itself well to that, right? That's one aspect of it. Then there is the policies. Do we have the right policies in place? Systems is, in my mind, to be honest, Pete, is when I talk to a lot of federal leaders, it's a secondary, tertiary problem. It's a little bit later downstream that you start figuring it out.
Don't try to put a technology in first, right?
Exactly.
It's don't buy it. Figure out what we're trying to glean from our data, know where it is before we apply technology. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and the way I like to say it, one of my favorite phrases is, don't first buy a hammer, then start looking for nails to hit, right? So you have to first identify what is the mission problem that you are trying to solve. And you got to figure out, do we have even the right policies in place that allow for this data exchange to take place? In order for this global integrated public health ecosystem, this dream to be a reality, we are talking about data sharing not just within the federal agency, the intramural. We are also talking extramural, across the United States federal agencies, across the state and local government, across private sector, research, academia. And you know what I shouldn't use the word beauty, but what's an interesting aspect is diseases do cross international borders.
Mm-hmm.
And today, the data travels slower than the disease travel. And that's the paradigm we have to change.
It's almost like you first of all, not almost like you did. It's the government is such a large organization. And I think when I look at the Federal Register from time to time, there's 450 plus agencies. And you mentioned your time in HHS. I mean, there's HRSA, there's NIH, there's HQ, there's CMS. It's just being able to bridge that communication and understand that it's not just a government thing, but healthcare data, which is pronounced, is something that impacts our lives and bringing the community together. That really resonates with me. There's no question in there. I just loved the way you explained that. Is the pandemic really brought the world together and we had to figure out problems and solve them together. So before I jump into this amazing framework you have here at CGI and your role in helping lead and convey that to your customers, what is it about when it comes to data, the strategic? There is having a strategy, but it would seem like sometimes the government needs help understanding how they have to think about data. Is that one of your mantras, teaching people how to think about data when you're working with your customer?
That is right. Here is something I heard very recently. I can't take credit for this statement, but it is very profound, so I'm going to leverage that. It is, data is the new vaccine of this generation. And I think it's a very profound statement. And that's how people have to think about data. That's the heart and core of it. So what does this really mean? A couple of people asked me when I repeated this, what does this really mean? What it means is, if the data is generated, analyzed, and utilized and applied correctly, it is going to result into us taking preventive measures and prevent public health emergencies from taking place, which is why the analogy with the vaccine. So I think that is how we have to think about data. And a big part of it is, you had also earlier asked me a little bit about how do you even start the conversation with the customers, right? Before we get into framework and what are the top 10 things they should worry about and such. The first thing that they have to start with, which is again coming from, at the end of the day, it is all about change management and a cultural change and a paradigm shift, right? So, what is very important to start out the dialogue with is to say, if you exchange and are willing to share the data and are willing to provide the right context to it and in a timely manner, what is the power that can be unleashed using this data? I think that power of data has to be front and center of the conversation, not the tools and the technology. They are means to an end. And once you talk about the power that can be unleashed, which will benefit the constituents, the public, right, and the citizens of the country, is that's when the program owners, they start getting more comfortable about, now I see how this is going to result into a return on investment to my mission outcomes. You got to tie it back to that.
I love it. And this is why I think it's a nice segue into there has to be some semblance of guardrails and framework. And I'd like to jump into that. But I'm going to tell you what I just heard you say, which I again, really appreciate, is the conversation matters. Data is the most foundational element of the hierarchy of wisdom, knowledge, and before it can become information, data with context, we have to know where it is. We have to find it, and then yes, we have to have and take into account the perspective of folks who know that. Because at the end of the day, if I heard you, actionable or applied intelligence is what we need so that we can save lives. We can make folks heal quicker, faster, better, and in the case of the pandemic, cure the world. So that was awesome. I appreciate that. That's great.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's do this. You wrote the 10 elements of a data strategy, and I was impressed with one. I love that things are generally structured this way. There's 10 of these: alignment with business strategy, roadmaps, data policies, governance, assessments, catalogs, security. We talked about a lot of these, but give an overview of this tool, this framework, how you use it with your customers, but a lot of what went into it, and what do you find to be not maybe the most important, but most significant when you're helping a customer on their journey with this framework?
Absolutely. And I think I started sharing some of it earlier, is it has to start with a couple different things which are very foundational. It has to start with aligning the data strategy of an organization with the mission strategy, because that is the core, the heart and center of it. If we cannot tie it back to mission outcomes, then we don't know why we are doing this, right? So one of the worst things that organizations can do is they have all these high priority and urgent projects that they put people on, and people are working very hard, but they don't know the big picture. They don't understand that how this outcome is going to be utilized. So I think having that data strategy and aligning with mission is extremely important. Second thing, as I said, is policy is very important, because you can have the best systems in place who are willing to talk to each other, but if your policy is going to preclude you or not enable you from sharing the data, the systems are just going to sit there. They are just going to be a dead building without any lights on, right?
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
But you're dealing with the federal government. We all know that policies have been around for a while, and while we've embraced technology, which is outpacing policy, have you run into, and this is not to be a hardball, but how do you have that conversation when a federal employee says, well, look, our policies are old and antiquated, and as much as we want to rewrite them, it takes time. What do you say to somebody who has a policy inertia that seems to be, what's holding them back from embracing a data strategy?
I think there are, it goes back to what is the mission outcome that we are trying to achieve. And if you start the conversation with that, it becomes a little bit hard to get the pushback that, okay, so you don't want to save the data, but we are trying to save lives. At the end of the day, what is all this data being used for? It is used for two simple things, especially in the health area, right? We are trying to save lives, and B, we are trying to improve lives and the citizen care. So it becomes a little bit of a harder conversation for the other party to say, no, we are not interested in doing that. How do you say no to that?
100%. Right? You just humanize the problem.
You humanize
yes.
it. You humanize it. Thanks. You're very eloquent in your use of words. You humanize it is a very important part in how you start the conversation. And other than that, it is a cultural change. I'm not going to say that, yeah, you humanize the conversation and boom, now you have a policy change that got initiated and came into bear, right? Is organizational change management is a huge component of it. Tools, technology, systems modernization, extremely important. I absolutely do not wish to undermine that. That is very, very important. But first, you start out with making sure that there is uh, there is an understanding, a mutual understanding that we are going to share data. And also, I want to play the flip side of it for a second. Sometimes, why is there inertia about this policy change? Not because those parties are trying to have inertia for the sake of having it, right? They have had their own experiences too. There is a reason certain policies are in place. There is always a reason policies are in place, right?
They're necessary.
They are necessary. They are absolutely necessary, and they are very healthy and absolutely required. A lot of times policies are in place and there is inertia to change it because it is not very clear how this data is going to be used. And that's a very important piece to have in the conversation, to say how this data is going to be used, how this data is going to be protected, how its provenance is going to be maintained.
And I'm seeing myself on the other side of the table going, I don't know. And that's what you're there to help with,
That's
to help
right.
them explore the usefulness of, one, where is the data, and do you still need it? I just had to riff off that because I started finding myself like, gosh, if Ratima's sitting across from me and I'm that customer, I might be saying, look, we don't have a strategy, or we need one. And it's not cookie cutter, though, from what I
Right,
heard, right?
right.
Because the federal data strategy, shout out to the federal government in 2019, released its foundational document that is intended to enable agencies to use and manage federal data to serve the American people. What can you talk about that strategy, if at all, and did that inform some of your thinking with this CGI Federal Data Strategy Framework?
Absolutely. So if you look at the data strategy, actually, I have the number here. I believe it has got 10 principles and 40 practices, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite. Exhaustive, and it has to be, because there are all these dimensions of the
Lots
data
to
strategy.
consider.
There is a lot to consider, and there is a reason why these things to be considered, so it has to be exhaustive. But here is my favorite part of it, and which is the part that I like to talk to the customers and I enjoy doing and helping them in their journey with, is the practices 1 to 10. And the practices 1 to 10, at the end of it, in layman's language, is focused on culture change. What it talks about is it is building a culture that values data and promotes public use. And when I was talking a little bit earlier, is to go back to that thought, is where we talk about barriers, right? Barriers for data modernization. A lot of times those barriers are in place by well-intended people because they are worried about, as I was starting to say, is how this data is going to be used. You know, is it going to be misused? How's the privacy going to be protected? Is it going to be secure? Is the context of data going to change as it starts moving along, right, in that cycle? And those are the things where a conversation has to take place. And that's where all the emerging technology, the cool tools and technology and systems modernization come into being, along with the governance aspect of it, is how all those things are going to be protected.
So let me pivot to the data science component of this, right? The government, you mentioned chief data officers, and yeah, I guess you can get a degree in chief data officers or go to a class. And I joke with, students in college, my own children, it's take a class on cyber, take a class in data and analytics, and understand that there are tools out there that can do things, the compute that you can't. I mean, the human brain's the most powerful, but hey, a computer runs 24/7 and we need sleep and caffeine. The tool component, though, what have you seen in your the evolution of this data strategy where tools and technology, not to discredit it, are helping us? I'm not going to get into the AI here, but there are tools that can help us understand and have those light bulb moments so that we can solve those mission problems. How is that tool exploration? What tools should we use if you're a customer? Do you get into that when you're talking about your framework? Is that a big part of your framework?
We absolutely do. And that's where we look into first understanding what systems are currently in place, doing a catalog and assessment of that. Systems assessment and current state assessment is extremely important. Then we talk about the to be state. And we as a system integrator, fortunately, have that benefit where we necessarily are not trying to sell a single solution. We are trying to sell or provide to the customers what makes best sense for the customer, and working also with their existing environment and infrastructure. Pete, you were in the government, you know this. We cannot modernize all of the federal government systems overnight or in 1 year or in 2 years or even in 5 years. It is a journey, it is not a milestone. So that's where we work very closely with the customers to understand. We actually come at it from two different lenses. One is what is some of the low-hanging fruit, because when we talked about the culture change, actually when you can demonstrate some quick wins, that also starts enabling the culture change because people start seeing the return on investment. But on the other hand, we also look at what are some of your most mission oriented systems, and then doing an assessment and starting to create a roadmap and figure out is how over a period of time you are going to start doing the modernization, and whether it is a complete rehaul or whether it is adding some additional wrappers on top of it. All that is part of the discussion in the journey.
Well, let's close this segment out with, and again, our audience, the words modernize, transform, and innovate are not the same. That is what I no longer say, hey, it's not a sprint, it's a journey, or it's not a marathon, it's however it goes. I look at it like it's neither. Yeah, there's times you sprint, other times you need to take the long, game and play, but it doesn't end. It's continuous. And I see this framework, the elements of your strategy, and I will just close with, you're talking about enabling a workforce, giving the tools, and depending upon that mission, it says right here, invest in retooling and training human capital with the skills needed to design and operate in the new environment. And when you said as is, I was writing down in my head, oh, she's going to talk about the as is to be and how we get there. And that is what this framework, and you do so well, I can tell, here at CGI. So let's close this out a little bit with, so you have all this knowledge, you're Ratima, the clearly well-spoken data strategist, scientist, expert here at CGI. You're also very involved in the federal community, the bridging of the public and private sector. Talk a little bit about that growth enablement role you have and some of the activities and groups you're associated with.
Absolutely. Similar to you, I consider myself a dot connector, Pete. And we know that there is a day job, and then we all have another job that stems from the day job, right? And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy being that bridge builder between the government and the industry. I'm a big proponent of Team USA. And I think because all of us in the ecosystem, whether it is government, industry, research, academia, we all have to come together. We all have a role to play. So I'm involved in a number of industry associations like ACT-IAC, AFCIA. I'm very involved in the AFCIA Bethesda chapter. Through ACT-IAC, I helped plan a lot of the major conferences. I was part of the Emerging Tech Conference that took place in May. I was actually on the data panel there. I was involved in the Health Innovation Summit that took place in June. I'm actually going to be moderating a panel on AI at the ELC Nation conference coming up at Hershey's in the fall here. And for the AFCIA Health IT also, which takes place every year in January, which is their star event for the AFCIA here in health. I'm leading a lot of the planning there as well. So very actively involved. And then in all my copious spare time I have on an ongoing basis.
Your other duties as assigned, right?
As assigned is I managed to do some work and create and shape panels through the ACT-IAC HHS Federal Insights Exchange Program, as well as the Health COI. So we have a number of events that are also coming up through those. Yeah.
Well, I asked the question, and while I've seen you on the circuit a few times here, there, and everywhere, and you are amazing, and you're a true collaborator, and I think this bridging, as much as connecting the dots, is so critical, and that is where at least we have a safe harbor at times to meet with your maybe to-be customers, but have those conversations where you're not selling. You're kind of in the tell mode. Here's what we do. Here's why it matters. And people get to know Ratima and CGI as a company that cares, a partner to the government. I like to use the phrase, it's not about buy, sell, it's about seek and solve. And so, so your comments on some of that.
Yeah, and I just want to sum it up in one sentence is we want to be trusted advisors to our customers. We want to help move the needle in the right direction and help them in whatever way it makes sense, and we want to be their trusted advisor.
Well, I get it.
And that's what I enjoy doing.
And I can tell, and your smile says it all, and I think that's something that, again, does not happen overnight, but needs to be fostered and cultivated, because you can lose it in a second. And I get a sense today that obviously it's your passion. You've been on both sides, and that's a credit to you and the CGI family. So what can government do better to enable the collaboration with partners like CGI?
I would say the request there would be is help us help you and talk to us about your most difficult problems. Let's exercise candor, let's be transparent, because we are partners in this ecosystem, and it is going to take all of us to solve some of the most difficult problems that our ecosystem is facing, especially in the health area. So let's have the transparent conversation, talk to us about your most difficult problems, and let's figure it out together.
And with that, I want to thank you for the time. I had many a light bulb moment, and I feel really good about you being at a company that's helping the federal government move the needle.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you, Pete.
You can find CGI Voices on your preferred podcast platform or watch the video version on YouTube. Subscribe or follow and spread the word to your colleagues. CGI Voices, expert insights for federal decision makers.